What unfolded in Washington did not begin as speculation, rumor, or political theater. It began with a closed-door meeting that was supposed to be routine and ended with the most serious internal rupture the Republican Party has faced since Watergate. At 7:43 a.m., three senior Republican Senate leaders entered Mitch McConnell's office for a scheduled leadership discussion. 47 minutes later, they exited knowing the party had crossed a point of no return. Within 2 hours, the consequences of that meeting were reverberating across Capitol Hill. This was not a dispute over legislation or strategy. It was a collective recognition among senior Republicans that Donald Trump had become ungovernable, and that continuing to enable him posed an existential threat to both the Senate and the party itself. The trigger for this revolt was not what most observers would expect. In the early hours of Wednesday morning at 2:17 a.m., President Trump placed a direct call to the Senate Majority Leader. During that call, he demanded an immediate vote on legislation he labeled the Emergency Powers Expansion Act. His message was not a request, it was an ultimatum. Pass the measure by Friday or face primary challenges backed by him in every Republican-held state. He explicitly threatened to campaign against sitting Republican senators in their own districts. Just hours later, at 6:30 a.m., a separate development accelerated everything. Audio recordings began circulating privately among senior Republican circles. In the recording, Trump is heard stating bluntly, "I do not need the Senate. These people work for me." The reaction was not fear, it was fury. By 7:43 a.m., an emergency meeting was convened. Present behind closed doors were Mitch McConnell, John Thune, John Barrasso, and John Cornyn. For 47 minutes, they confronted what many of them had privately avoided acknowledging for years. Trump was no longer attempting to dominate the party from outside the institution. He was openly declaring the institution irrelevant. To understand why this moment mattered, it is essential to understand how Trump maintained control over Senate Republicans for nearly 8 years. His authority did not stem from ideology or legislative vision. It was built on fear carefully cultivated and selectively deployed. Senators had watched colleagues serve as cautionary examples. Mitt Romney's vote to convict Trump during impeachment resulted in immediate ostracization and lasting political damage. Bill Cassidy's vote in the second impeachment triggered years of humiliation and ultimately did not protect him from retaliation. Kevin McCarthy's removal as Speaker after defying Trump on debt negotiations reinforced the lesson that loyalty delayed punishment but never prevented it. Trump's system was authoritarian in structure. Punish a few, terrify the rest. For years, it worked, but fear only functions until the targets realize the threat is permanent. That realization arrived this week as three forces converged. First, the electoral math changed. The upcoming Senate map is deeply unfavorable to Republicans, with far more Republican seats at risk than Democratic ones. Internal polling now shows Trump's involvement costing candidates between 6 and 8 points in key states. One senator summarized the shift bluntly: conservatism can be defended, chaos cannot. Second, Trump's foreign policy rhetoric, particularly threats involving Greenland and allied territory, crossed from embarrassment into danger. Senate members with national security responsibilities understood that threatening military action against allies destabilizes the global order and directly undermines U.S. credibility. Third, legal exposure intensified. Multiple criminal cases accelerated simultaneously, with trial dates solidifying and appeals failing. Republican legal strategists privately acknowledged the unprecedented risk of nominating a candidate who could face federal custody during an election cycle. Inside McConnell's office, these realities converged. McConnell opened the meeting by playing the full audio recording of Trump declaring the Senate subordinate to him. He played it twice. The room fell silent. The implication was unmistakable. This was not frustration with legislative resistance, it was a rejection of constitutional balance. John Thune broke the silence. He stated plainly that Senate leadership could no longer defend Trump's conduct, not the emergency powers demand, not the foreign policy rhetoric, not the threats against their own members. He argued that voters were exhausted and would not accept explanations for behavior that appeared reckless and authoritarian. John Barrasso responded with visible conflict. He warned that open opposition would invite destruction, primary challenges, humiliation, and political exile. He reminded them of those who had already paid that price and asked how this situation differed. McConnell leaned forward and delivered the sentence that changed the trajectory of the party. He said it was different because Trump was going to destroy them regardless. The question, McConnell argued, was not survival, but whether they would fall defending Trump or defending the Senate itself. If no line was drawn now, there would be no institution left to preserve. John Cornyn reinforced the argument with data. Texas polling showed him trailing, with nearly every lost point tied to Trump-related chaos. Voters wanted governance, not senators justifying erratic threats toward allied nations. McConnell then laid out a plan, not symbolic, but structural. Leadership would issue a joint letter refusing to advance emergency powers expansion. They would withhold campaign support unless Trump moderated his rhetoric. If Trump initiated primaries, the full financial power of the Republican Senate apparatus would be deployed to defend incumbents. He demanded an answer immediately. Thune agreed. Cornyn agreed. Barrasso hesitated, calling it political suicide. McConnell replied that it was simply the job they were elected to do. Barrasso finally agreed. With 4 commitments, the foundation of Trump's control cracked. Within hours, McConnell began calling senior senators. Several commitments were expected: Romney, Collins, Murkowski. 2 were not: Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio. Graham's defection was seismic. A longtime defender of Trump, he reportedly told colleagues he could not defend threats against allies, the dismantling of Senate authority, or branding dissenters as traitors. By mid-morning, the letter was drafted. 5 pages of constitutional framing stated clearly that Senate leadership could no longer enable conduct that undermined constitutional order and legislative independence. By noon, 12 signatures were secured. Trump was alerted shortly thereafter. His response, according to circulating messages, was immediate and furious. He began calling allies. Calls to Graham and Rubio ended abruptly, with neither backing down. McConnell did not take Trump's calls at all. By early afternoon, the divide was visible. House Republicans issued statements of support for Trump. Senate leadership remained silent. Within hours, the letter was public. More significant than the letter itself was what followed. Senate leadership prepared contingency plans for escalation, coordinated public defense, financial backing against primaries, and, if necessary, formal legislative action to curtail executive emergency authority. Democrats, meanwhile, chose restraint. Rather than exploit the chaos, they stayed publicly silent while privately signaling support for institutional limits. This deprived Trump of an external enemy and forced the conflict to remain internal. As the day progressed, pressure mounted from every direction: donors, staff, allies, and international partners. Conservative media fractured. Corporate America issued statements emphasizing constitutional stability. NATO allies publicly expressed alarm. By Thursday morning, leaked polling showed Trump's endorsement producing a 6-point swing against Republican candidates. Staffers in Senate offices circulated their own letter, warning they would resign rather than defend further escalation. Trump responded by escalating further, calling for rallies, backing primary challengers, and encouraging protests. Senate leadership responded calmly, stating publicly that the Senate serves the Constitution, not any individual. Privately, McConnell secured assurances from moderate Democrats that emergency powers limitations would pass if needed. The votes were there. The revolt had already succeeded. This moment represents more than a policy dispute. It is the collapse of an authoritarian control mechanism. Fear stopped working. Collective action neutralized retaliation. Institutional authority was reclaimed. What comes next remains uncertain. Trump may retreat, stall, or escalate into full rupture. But one fact is now irreversible. The Republican Party has entered a structural fracture, not an emotional one. This confrontation is not about Greenland or emergency statutes. It is about control. Trump demanded absolute authority. The Senate refused. That refusal has altered the balance of power, and the consequences will define the future of the party and potentially the country. What makes this rupture uniquely dangerous is not simply that it is internal, but that it removes the stabilizing assumptions that have governed American politics for decades. Until now, the Republican Party functioned on the belief that internal dissent could always be suppressed before it reached a breaking point. That belief no longer holds. Once Senate leadership crossed the threshold from private concern to public coordination, the balance of power shifted irreversibly. Trump's leverage depended on fragmentation, isolating critics, punishing them individually, and forcing the rest into silence. The moment senators moved as a bloc, that leverage collapsed. Retaliation no longer produced obedience, it produced resistance. The immediate effect was paralysis at the executive-legislative boundary. The White House could no longer assume compliance from the Senate, even with unified party control. Routine coordination broke down. Legislative scheduling stalled. Committee chairs delayed hearings connected to executive authority. Staff-level cooperation slowed as Senate offices imposed new internal review processes on communications with the administration. This was not sabotage, it was containment. Behind closed doors, Senate leadership began operating on a new assumption that Trump was not merely an unpredictable political actor, but a destabilizing force whose impulses had to be constrained for institutional survival. That assumption changed how every decision was evaluated. The question was no longer, will this anger Trump, but will this outlive Trump? The White House, sensing the shift, attempted to reassert dominance through escalation. The strategy was familiar: public humiliation, threats, and mobilization of the base. But this time, the results were different. Instead of forcing capitulation, the attacks hardened opposition. Senators who had hesitated now saw that restraint did not reduce risk. Silence invited attack as much as defiance. The party's donor class responded accordingly. Financial networks that once deferred to Trump's influence began hedging. Contributions were quietly redirected toward incumbents aligned with Senate leadership. Super PACs recalibrated messaging away from personal loyalty and toward institutional stability. This was not ideological rebellion, it was risk management. At the same time, foreign governments adjusted their posture. Allied embassies in Washington increased direct engagement with congressional leadership, particularly the Senate, bypassing executive channels when possible. The implicit message was unmistakable. Allies no longer trusted the White House as the sole custodian of American commitments. This had consequences inside the national security apparatus. Career officials, already strained by erratic directives, began relying more heavily on congressional guidance and statutory authority. Informal coordination between defense officials and Senate committees intensified, not to undermine civilian control, but to ensure continuity in the event of executive volatility. What emerged was a quiet rebalancing of power: constitutional, procedural, and psychological. Trump, for his part, interpreted resistance as betrayal rather than warning. That perception narrowed his options. Every escalation further alienated moderates, donors, and institutional actors, while binding him more tightly to a shrinking circle of loyalists. The party was no longer divided into supporters and opponents. It was dividing into institutionalists and personalists. This distinction matters because it determines how the conflict ends. Institutionalists can compromise, personalists cannot. Their legitimacy depends on total loyalty and constant confrontation. As the Senate increasingly aligned itself with institutional preservation, Trump's capacity to negotiate diminished. The most dangerous phase of this conflict lies not in immediate legislative battles, but in the erosion of shared reality within the party. As rhetoric intensified, parallel narratives emerged, one framing the Senate as defending constitutional order, the other framing it as a captured enemy. Once those narratives harden, reconciliation becomes structurally difficult. The longer the standoff persists, the more likely it becomes that temporary measures evolve into permanent realignments. Committees adjust norms, donors rewrite expectations, voters recalibrate identity. Parties do not fracture in moments of drama, they fracture through sustained misalignment between leadership, incentives, and survival. What is unfolding is not yet a formal split, but it is a decoupling. Authority is separating from personality, loyalty is being reassessed against cost, fear is being replaced by calculation. Whether the Republican Party ultimately reunifies or fractures depends on one unresolved variable: escalation. If Trump continues to treat institutional resistance as an enemy to be crushed rather than a boundary to be respected, he accelerates the very outcome he seeks to prevent. Every attack clarifies the choice senators must make. Every threat simplifies the math. History suggests that parties survive strong leaders. They rarely survive leaders who demand to replace the party itself. The revolt, then, is not a moment. It is a process. And once that process begins, control no longer belongs to any single individual. It belongs to momentum, incentives, and the slow, unforgiving logic of political survival. This moment represents more than a policy dispute. It is the collapse of an authoritarian control mechanism. Fear stopped working. Collective action neutralized retaliation. Institutional authority was reclaimed. What comes next remains uncertain. Trump may retreat, stall, or escalate into full rupture. But one fact is now irreversible. The Republican Party has entered a structural fracture, not an emotional one. This confrontation is not about Greenland or emergency statutes. It is about control. Trump demanded absolute authority. The Senate refused. That refusal has altered the balance of power, and the consequences will define the future of the party and potentially the country.